The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Okay, that's the right message. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Alan Blumkin on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. I'm here with my co-host, David Nemec, for the program for David Nemec's old-time baseball history and trivia. And today we're going to pick up a discussion on the evolution of scheduling, starting with 1884. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Al. It's a pleasure to be with you again.
Okay, so it's your floor. You're the authority on it.
1884 was a bizarre year, one of a kind. You had three rebel major league formed. If you recall from our last meeting, we talked about the formation of the American Association, which came into play in 1882 as a rebel major league. And in their third year of operation, by that time they had made semi-peace with the National League, and we're looking forward to a peaceful 1884 season until another rebel major league formed called the Union Association. The Union Association did not honor the reserve clause, and they would honor contracts for 1 year only, but after that, everybody was fair game. And they would not honor contracts of other leagues. So as a result, the Union Association went on a raiding expedition over the winter of 1883-84 and pilfered some stars from both the American Association and the National League. And they got off the ground in 1884 as an 8-team league. And meanwhile, the National League convinced the American Association, look, you've got to protect some of your cities. You can't allow the Union Association to form and put teams in places like Brooklyn, which are, Brooklyn was a great bastion for baseball. So the American Association took the bait and expanded from 8 to 12 teams, making for a very unwieldy major league. And the Union Association, meanwhile, had 8 teams, and the National League had eight teams. And the 8 teams could form a 112-game schedule. That was the way the schedule broke up in the National League. And
that's 8 times 4. 7 times, something like 7 times 16.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it, 7 times 16, yeah.
7 times 16, exactly. The American Association is very tough to figure out what their schedule was at the time because one team folded. The Washington team folded. They were replaced by a team in Virginia and Richmond, and based in Richmond. And the Union Association, meanwhile, formed with a team in the smallest city ever to start the season in the major leagues. That was Altoona, Pennsylvania. That was the 8th team formed in the Union Association. And the president of the Union Association and founding father, Henry Lucas, did Altoona the additional favor of scheduling most of Altoona's early games with his St. Louis Maroons, which were a powerhouse. They'd raided the National League for players such as Fred Dunlap, Orator Schaefer. They had a very, very strong team. And the Altoona team, as a result, barely got off the launching pad because they were just buried by the Maroons in game after game after game. And the Maroons actually started the season 20-0 before they finally lost a game. And the pennant race effectively was over in the Union Association as a result, pretty much by June 1st. But nevertheless, the Union Association struggled on. The 8 teams that originally started with were in St. Louis, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, Altoona, and Cincinnati. Those were not the teams that finished the season. Only 4 of those teams finished. Actually, I think 5 finished the season. St. Louis, Cincinnati, Baltimore, Boston, and Washington struggled on to play full schedules. The Philadelphia team moved. The Altoona team moved. And by the end of the season, you had teams in the Union Association playing in such sterling cities as Wilmington, Delaware, St. Paul, Minnesota. Kansas City had a team for the first time in the major leagues. And no team, and the Chicago team, which began the season as Chicago Browns, moved to Pittsburgh and then had to move again. I think they were the team that ended up in St. Paul toward the end of the season. The American Association with 12 teams was very unwieldy. The National League, which was stable throughout, all 8 teams finished the season. They all played pretty much a full schedule. The Providence team with Charlie Radburn, who won 59 games that year. Some say 60, and a case can be made that he won 60. Fairly strong case because at the time he was credited with 60 wins. Expos
pitched every day, basically.
Basically pitched every day after another pitcher on the team, Charlie Sweeney, absconded to the Union Association with the St. Louis team. And the National League finished the season in good shape. And they challenged the winner of the American Association, which was the New York Mets, to a World Series. The first World Series between 2 leagues was played between the pennant-winning New York Mets, which were a surprise pennant winner, the Philadelphia and Cincinnati teams, and with St. Louis a strong contender too, were more or less favored to, at least one of those 3 teams was favored to take the pennant. But New York snuck through, took the pennant, and because New York was such a large city, the Providence team agreed to have all the World Series games played in New York, thinking the games would be a big draw there. They were anything but. The weather didn't cooperate. The New York team didn't cooperate. And it was supposed to be the best 3 out of 5 series. Ended up being only 3 games. It could have ended up being only 2 games. It's supposed to be the best 2 out of 3 series. And Providence won both the first 2 games, but they played the 3rd game anyway. And they wound up wanting that too. So, and they also agreed, very generously to play under American Association rules. So for the first time, National League batsmen could take their base if they were hit by a pitch. And as a result, the first 2 batsmen in Providence in the very first game of the World Series ended up on first and second base because Tim Keefe, the New York Mets pitcher, managed to hit both of them. And that started the downhill slide for the New York Mets in more ways than one. Whereas they were a strong team that year, they were rated after the season by the New York National League team, and many of their better players fled, including Keefe and Dude Estabrook, their 3rd baseman, to the National League club. Now,
John Day, the owner, had interest in both of them.
John Day, exactly.
Yeah.
Good point, Al. John Day was the major stockholder in both the New York Mets and the New York. They were called the Gothams. They didn't become the Giants really until about 1886. But he knew that his future lay in the National League, not in the American Association. The National League was the stronger of the 2. It had good, strong franchises in the big cities, in Boston, in Chicago, and he gambled that that's where he should put his better players. And as a result, the New York Mets were raided, and they became they landed in the doldrums of the American Association for the next 3 years before they finally gave up the ghost, dropped out of the association.
That was basically, essentially, the first indication of syndicalism, right?
That's a good point. That's a good point. Most people don't realize that because Day, in effect, was a syndicate owner. He had heavy stakes in both the Mets and the Gothams, and treated the Mets as a stepchild. They got the work. Their schedule was drawn up in such a way that the New York National League team got the more attractive dates. The New York National League team also got use of the Polo Grounds, and the Mets played on a field behind the Polo Grounds, which was not even really of major league quality. But they nevertheless were the stronger of the two teams in 1884. The Union Association, meanwhile, which managed to finish the season, and by the finish of the season, fortunately for the St. Louis club, Cincinnati also drew several National League talents like Jack Glasscock and Jim McCormick from Cleveland, raiding the Cleveland Club in mid-season. So that by the end of the season, the Cincinnati and St. Louis clubs were pretty evenly matched. And they did play a kind of postseason series, unofficially, with St. Louis winning the postseason series and then being acclaimed universally as the pennant winner in the Union Association. And the Union Association gave every indication of being willing to continue into 1885. Lucas threatened to put teams in cities like Chicago again, and other major cities like. And he also talked about Detroit, which by that time had a National League team. And he was a threatening force. And to counter him, the National League team pulled a kind of a fast one on Chris Bondurant, the owner of the St. Louis Browns and the American Association, because by that time the rules in baseball were such that, with the exception of New York, which allowed two teams, the New York Mets and the New York Giants, only because they were under the same ownership. Other cities were allowed to have only one major league team, so there would be no competition between the two rival leagues for that city. But the Union Association, when it started to make noises that it was going to continue the battle into 1885, a National League seduced Henry Lucas, the National League, into the National League, telling him he could bring his St. Louis Maroons into the league, and that the National League would also agree to allow him to keep blacklisted players like Charlie Sweeney, George Schaefer, and Fred Dunlap for three, and there were several others who had jumped contracts in the National League to play in the Union Association. The St. Louis Maroons would be allowed to keep them, and would be included as the eighth team in the National League. They replaced the Cleveland Club, which was forced to fold after they lost Glasscock, McCormick, and a catcher named Fatty Briotti to the Cincinnati Club, reducing the league to 7 teams. And they came in as the 8th team in 1885. And the American Association, meanwhile, after struggling with 12 teams, unwieldy 12 teams, in 1884, gave a sigh of relief, lopped off the weaker teams that had been part of the association, such as teams in Indianapolis and a team that had ended up in Richmond at the end of the year, and Toledo, which had featured the first 2 African-American players, the Walker brothers, Weldy and Moses Walker. Moses was a very good player, a very good catcher, and could have stayed in the major league. Weldy was kind of added to the team as an afterthought. But he did play in a few games. Meanwhile, the National League and American Association then began the 1885 season with 8 teams only. And that was the way things remained in baseball until 1890.
They were playing 112 game schedules.
They were playing 112 game schedules. But they expanded that they started to expand it in 1886. I believe 86, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, 86 they expanded to playing. They played 120. Wait a minute, let's see.
With the Iron and the 20.
They added 2 more.
They
games.
added two more games for each team of the 126.
Yeah, 120. They played a 126 game schedule, and they both leagues, the association and the National League, even though they were stable 8-team leagues at the top, were anything but stable among their bottom feeders. The National League changed teams almost every year. They began the 1886 season with teams in St. Louis, Kansas City, and Washington. In 1887, the St. Louis and Kansas City team had been replaced by Pittsburgh, who was the first American Association team to desert the association to join the National League, and a team in Indianapolis. The American Association, upon losing Pittsburgh, was forced to struggle to find an 8th team. And they reinstated a major league team in Cleveland. So the 1887 season began with Cleveland in the American Association, formerly a National League team. Pittsburgh, formerly an American Association team, now in the National League. And it continued that way throughout the remainder of the 1880s. 1889 season was very, very pivotal in that the St. Louis Browns had won 4 pennants in a row from 85 through 88. And it played in 4 World Series with the National League, and given the National League pretty stiff competition throughout. In 1889, lost the association pennant a chance and they really were in the race the whole way. They lost near the end of the season to the team from the Brooklyn team, who ended their 4-year reign, and the American and the National League pennant was won for the second time in a row by the New York.
There was a book that came out several years ago on that season, which I have, which is pretty good.
Yeah, it's a very good book, an excellent book. And the 89 season was interesting in a number of ways. It was the first season in the National League that came down to the final day of the campaign to decide who the pennant winner would be. Going into the final day that morning, both Boston and New York had chances of winning the National League pennant. The Boston team featured John Clarkson, 50-game winner, or going for his 50th. I believe he was going for his 50th win on that day, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, he had 49 wins going into the final day of the season and shooting for his 50th win. And if he had won his 50th game and New York had lost, the Boston team would have taken the pennant. And it would have made a difference historically quite a bit in the way things played out. Instead, Clarkson lost. The New York team won. So the New York team faced Brooklyn in what was considered, if there had been such thing as a subway.
First subway
series. 1889 is the first
subway
series.
Subway didn't start here until 1904.
No, it didn't. So, and so travel then was, mostly, from I think it was by ferry. I don't
ferry,
know.
and they opened the Brooklyn Bridge up in, I believe it was 1883. Yeah.
83.
Brooklyn and New York were connected. Brooklyn and Manhattan were connected.
Brooklyn and Manhattan were connected by the
Brooklyn Bridge. That was the first time, yeah.
Yeah. So it was and Brooklyn was still a separate city. So
yeah,
it really
Brooklyn,
was. It really.
1898 was when the unification happened.
Yeah.
Some people in Brooklyn still say it's the worst thing that ever happened to them.
They do, and they still hate.
Yeah.
They hate it when you say you're going into the city and you mean Manhattan.
Yeah.
Because they resent it deeply, and I agree with them. But in any case, the 1889 season ended in very tumultuously in the American Association at the winter meetings. Both Cincinnati and Brooklyn decided to desert the American Association and join the National League for the 1890 season in place of teams in Washington and Indianapolis. The Washington and Indianapolis teams were lopped off. Cincinnati and Brooklyn moved to the National League. Cleveland also by that time was in the National League. And the American Association, to begin the 1890 season, was forced to struggle until almost opening day before they ended up putting teams in Toledo, Syracuse, Rochester, and Columbus. Columbus had joined the National League in American Association in 89.
Now, these are all AAA cities now.
Yeah, they're all AAA cities. And in 1890, they were major league cities. And for Rochester, it was their only year in the major leagues. They never had a major league team again. Syracuse had one in the National League, although it didn't finish the season in 79. And Columbus had previously had a team in the American Association in 83 and 84 that folded prior to the 1885 season. But the most important thing that happened in 1890 was the formation of yet another rebel major league. And this was the most important rebel major league in most respects in the 19th century. The Players League, which was formed by the players, for the players, and with support. They got outside support, money from investors, and
this
they
is
put
because
teams.
The National League had put in that classification system that they devised when John Montgomery Ward was on a tour over that winter between 1888 and 1889, trying to export baseball to places that were really not ready for it.
Right. We should back up a bit to that tour, because while he was gone, John Brush, the owner of the Indianapolis team, put in a classification system rating players from A to E.
Yeah.
And the A players were the top.
The Portman was part of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And the players resented it. They refused to go along with it. And they've been rumbling and grumbling for years about the reserve clause and the way salaries were being curtailed. And Ward got his troops together. Tim Keefe was his main lieutenant, and they raided not only National League teams but also the American Association, and skimmed off the cream in both leagues, and formed a third major league in 1890. And unlike other seasons, like when the Federal League formed in 14 and 15, or the Union Association in 84, the Rebel Leagues were not the weaker league. The Rebel League in 1890, the Players League, was by far the strongest league in terms of the quality of baseball, the talent, and also in drawing power. They deliberately scheduled games to compete with National League teams on the same day at the same time. And in New York, the two parks were adjacent to each other. So fans who were watching the New York National League team could hear the cheering going on behind them for the New York Players League team. And I think at one point there was even a home run hit in one of the stadiums that landed in the other stadium. I think Mike Tiernan of the Giants.
Who's the only Giant, as far as I could see, Giant regular that stayed with them?
Yeah.
The rest of them, I think,
he had pretty much jumped. And the Players League, interestingly, even though most of their talent came from the National League, you had almost all the National League stars with one huge exception, and that was Cap Anson. Anson refused to desert, refused to lead the Chicago team, and resented all the players who had jumped. Another player who refused to jump was John Clarkson. And there were others who recanted. Jack Glasscock was yet another. Ed McKean threatened to jump, a shortstop with Cleveland. And most of these players signed contracts with the Players League team, and then after recanting, some of them were taken to court. The courts ended up ruling that they could stay with their National League clubs. But bitter animosity came out of this. And it probably ruined the Hall of Fame chances of Jack Glasscock, because Glasscock for years had been playing with second-rate teams in the National League and grumbling about it and moaning and groaning and saying, I want to be with a contender. I know, I'm a much better player than I'm showing here in Indianapolis, or, he's played with Indianapolis and he played with a terrible team. The Maroons came into the National League. And finally, in 1890, he had his chance to jump to the Players League, and the New York team paid him big time. The New York National League team raised his salary, and they managed to get him to stay in the National League. And people think it cost him a chance at the Hall of Fame, because case can be made that he was probably the best all-around shortstop in the 19th century. But in any case, most of the National...
When they had the three leagues, did they all play similar schedules?
They all played similar schedules. Yeah, they all played similar schedules, but they did not play by the same rules. The Players League decreased or increased the pitching distance, for one. They had a 2-umpire system for 2. They had an infield fly rule for 3. The first infield fly rule. So they played under different rules. And they foresaw that the game was changing in favor of the pitcher. In 1889, this was showing up. In 1888 was foreshadowing. 1889, it was showing up that pitching was really, really dominating the game. So they decided to make this a hitter's game in 1890, and it was reflected in the final statistics. The earned run averages were much higher for the pitchers. The batting averages were higher for the hitters. And those rule changes, ultimately, all 3 of them were, the 2-umpire system, the increased pitching distance, and the infield fly rule. Even though they went by the boards when the American Players League collapsed after the 1890 season, were eventually implemented in the National League by the mid-1890s. The 2-umpire system was not. There were experimentation with that, but by 1898-99, it was pretty firmly in place. So the Players League had all the best of it. There were 2 big mistakes they made that I think would have changed the complexion of baseball. One, like the National League, they refused to play on Sunday. The American Association continued to play on Sunday in cities that allowed it. Secondly, they refused to allow black players. There was an unwritten colored line. If the Players League had taken on black players, and there were many, many good ones, and scheduled games on Sunday, my contention is that the Players League, not the American Association, would have survived into 1891. And the Players League would have gone head to head with the National League, and the National League would have been the one to cave. They didn't do it, and the National League, the major National League owner who got the Players League to cave was Al Spalding. Spalding was a very shrewd operator, former player, became a sporting goods mogul, and had a big stake in the Chicago team. And he was the one who got Anson to stay in Chicago and manage the club and play as player manager. But if the Players League I still think if they played on Sunday and broken the color line, the game today, it would have changed everything.
Well, Jim Crow, basically, it was firmly in place by then.
It was.
Yeah.
But most of the major league teams did play exhibition games with players and black players until the late 1880s. Most of the top minor leagues had black players. Moses Walker played on the 1889 Syracuse team in the International League. When Syracuse was taken into the American Association in 1890, he was cut from the Syracuse team. He didn't accompany it to the National League. But so the American Association and National League were firmly behind the unwritten color line. But the Players League unfortunately went along with it, and they did not play on Sunday. But meanwhile, the expectation was, both of the savvy fans they were seeing, okay, this is the first time American Association players and National League players are playing in the same mix in the same league. We can look to see who really are the most dominant players among the players. And everybody expected the National League players to be dominant. To virtually the entire country's surprise, all the leaders across in both pitching and hitting were American Association players. Pete Browning, formerly of Louisville, led the American Association in batting. The National League player did leading runs, Hugh Duffy. Bases on balls were led by a rookie with Brooklyn, Bill Joyce. Stolen bases were led by Harry Stovey, staunch American Association player. Home runs were led by Roger Connor of the National League, but the pitching was dominated by Mark Baldwin of Chicago, Gus Wayne of Brooklyn, Silver King of Chicago. These were all three former American Association players. So the American Association fared very well when the two leagues mixed their talent in 1890. But unfortunately, the Players League didn't survive, and we came into the 1891 season with both the National League and the American Association on the ropes. The National League was a little better shape than the American Association. Their teams were stronger. Their fan base was stronger, and the American Association was still reeling from having dealt with teams like Rochester, Syracuse, and Toledo the year before. And at the end of the 1891 season, the American Association began to listen to offers from the National League for a merger, and finally caved in December of 1890. And by the early part of the following year,
in 1891, did the American Association play a full schedule in 1891?
Yeah, I'm sorry, they have the winter of 1890. Yeah, December of 1891.
Yeah,
they did play a full schedule, with the exception of the Baltimore. I think it was which team was it that folded? The Washington team. Well, no, wait a minute. Wow, the Cincinnati team the American Association, began the 1891 season with only 7 teams firmly in place. And they got Mike King Kelly to take over a team in Cincinnati, which was going to be called Kelly's Killers. And they were anything but on the field. They were a poor second division team, and Kelly eventually deserted the American Association and jumped back to the National League. But meanwhile, the American Association pennant winner was the Boston team, which was more or less composed of the same team, same players that won the Players League pennant the year before for Boston. Dan Bruthers, Duffy. Duffy was actually with Chicago in '90, but he moved to Boston in '91. Boston picked up Bill Joyce from Brooklyn, and Boston fielded a very, very strong team in 1891. And the Chicago team came out of nowhere to lead the National League for most of the season. And Anson, who hated the Players League and hated what had happened and hated everything that had happened pretty much in 1890, agreed that if his Chicago team won the pennant, that they would play the Boston American Association team in a World Series. The World Series that extended into 1890 when Brooklyn had played the Louisville pennant winner.
Yeah, I wound up in
last World Series between the two leagues.
I went up in a 3-game all tie.
And then in the tie, and then they never played the 7th game due to poor weather and lack of interest. But the Chicago team led deep into the season, and a very, very strong case can be made that the 1891 National League season was rigged at the end so that the Boston team won the pennant. And the Boston team was strong National League bastion and refused to play the American Association Boston team in a World Series. But if Chicago had won the pennant and had played in the World Series, who knows but what the American Association may have survived to fight on for a couple more years. Eventually it would have been too much, because the 1890s were not a decade that could support 2 major leagues. And what they were forced to do was support a merger of the National League and American Association, which contained the 8 National League teams plus 4 of the stronger American Association teams, and formed into an unwieldy 12-team league, which called itself the National League and American Association of Baseball Clubs. Most sports writers by the end of the decade were calling it simply the National League. But the 1892 season was famous in another respect, not only because of the 12-team league and the merger of the National League and American Association, but it was the first season to play both a split season and a 154-game schedule.
I mean, all
the norm.
Yeah, the 11. Everybody was playing the other 11 teams 14 times.
14 times.
Yeah.
Right.
And
exactly.
It's funny, when the strike happened in 1981 and they went to a split season, some people were shocked. And I said, this has been done before in 1892. I said, this is not new. People looking at me like, I'm from another planet.
I know. Those are the same people who will look at you now and say that, that Houston is the first team to win a pennant in 2 different major leagues. And that's not true. Houston, the only franchise to win a pennant in 2 different major leagues.
Yeah.
And that's not true. Because Brooklyn did it in the 1890s.
Yeah, Brooklyn did it in successive years. And the Cincinnati team won the American Association pennant, and it was still the same franchise that won the National League pennant in 1919. In fact, one of the trivia contests I wrote years ago locally, I said 4 of the current National League teams had their origins in the American Association, which of course was Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, the Dodgers, and St. Louis.
Yeah. That comprised half the National League.
Yeah, I gave him a hint that 3 of them were still in the same places.
Yeah. Yeah, that's but the 1892 season, as a result, you had 154 game schedule. Boston won the first half of the season with ease. They had a very strong team, and the Cleveland team, which hadn't done that well in the first half of the season, I think the Boston team led up in the second half.
Yeah, at some point they shrunk the scheduling to 132. I don't know whether that was economic or because of there was a depression at that time.
There was, yeah, they had.
I know a couple of the seasons in the 1890s when there was the 12-team league, they shrunk the schedule from 154 to 132.
Well, they shrunk it after the 92 season, and they restored the 154 game schedule in 98. In 98 and 99, they played 154 game schedules. And then at the end of the 99 season, the National League reduced from 12 to 8 teams, knocking off Cleveland, Baltimore, Washington, and Louisville. And that led to the formation, of course, of the American League as a rival major league, which included Cleveland and Baltimore and Washington. Louisville never had a major league team again. But they played a 154 game schedule, but that was knocked down in 1900 to 140 games.
Maybe we should, start the 20th century next time.
I think you're right. That's a good point. Good place.
Okay, I want to thank you, David, for your usual expertise in this area. And as usual, it's a pleasure. I hope people that listen to this get something out of it, and we'll see you the next time.
Great.
Okay,
Thank
David.
You,
Okay, hold on for a second. I'm going to close it off, and then I want to ask you something. Hold on.
Sure.